The patrol car cruised down a quiet street in downtown Boston, its lights occasionally reflecting off the windows of brick buildings. Officer Rick Morgan had been with the Boston Police Department for over 15 years. Known for his stern demeanor, Rick prided himself on keeping order in the city. That day, his shift had been uneventful, and he was ready to call it a night. Then he spotted a car that seemed slightly out of place. A modest sedan idling near a corner where upscale shops and offices lined the street. Rick slowed his cruiser, watching the vehicle. The driver, a young man with a slightly awkward posture, seemed to be fiddling with something on the passenger seat. Rick squinted and muttered, "What's he up to?" Pulling behind the sedan, he flipped on his lights. The bright flashes illuminated the interior of the car in rhythmic bursts. The driver startled, fumbling with his wallet. When he stepped out at Rick's command, his movements were hesitant but deliberate. The young man, who appeared to be in his late 20s, had an unmistakable look. His round face, almond-shaped eyes, and slightly slurred speech pointed to Down syndrome. "License and registration," Rick barked, his tone sharp. The man held out the documents, his hands trembling. "My name is Ethan," he said quietly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Rick glanced over the paperwork but didn't soften. "What are you doing here at this time of night, Ethan? You look suspicious." "I work nearby," Ethan said, gesturing towards a courthouse in the distance. "I stayed late to finish some files." Rick raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched into his face. "Files? At the courthouse? You expect me to believe that?" Ethan nodded earnestly. "I just started my new job. It's important to me." Rick smirked. "And what's this new job, huh? Cleaning up?" Ethan's face fell, the confidence he had mustered crumbling under Rick's words. "No, sir," he replied, his voice barely audible. I'm a judge." Rick blinked, the smirk vanishing from his face. He laughed derisively. "A judge? Is this some kind of joke?" Ethan shook his head. "No, sir. I went to school, passed the exams, and I was sworn in last week. Judge Ethan Harper. Please, you can call my supervisor to check." Rick narrowed his eyes, the weight of the young man's words beginning to sink in. But his skepticism and prejudice refused to let go entirely. "All right, Ethan, stay put," he said, walking back to his cruiser to run the man's details. Ethan stood by his car, fidgeting nervously as the seconds stretched into minutes. He glanced at the courthouse, the place where he had spent years studying law, interning, and finally earning his spot on the bench. He had fought harder than most to be taken seriously, and now this moment felt like another battle in a war he thought he'd won. Rick stared at the results on his computer screen. Judge Ethan Harper, newly appointed. Everything checked out. A pang of unease crept into his chest. He knew he had been unfair, and now he faced the consequences of his assumptions. Rick stepped out of the cruiser, his tone hesitant now. "Looks like everything's in order, Judge Harper." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He looked Rick in the eye, his expression calm but firm. "You didn't think it would be," he said quietly. "Did you?" Rick opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Ethan sighed, got into his car, and drove away. As the taillights faded into the distance, Rick stood frozen, grappling with a realization that would haunt him long after that night. The next morning, Ethan Harper walked into the courthouse with his head held high, determined not to let the events of the previous night cloud his achievements. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the courthouse lobby, casting long shadows on the marble floor. Ethan had worked too hard to be deterred now. Every step he took reminded him of the years of struggle. Every sneer, every door slammed in his face, every time someone said he wasn't capable because of his condition. When Ethan reached his chambers, he saw a bouquet of flowers on his desk. A small note was tucked between the vibrant petals. "Congratulations on your appointment. We're proud of you. Your family." He smiled, the gesture warming his heart. His parents had been his biggest supporters, always encouraging him to prove the doubters wrong. Their belief in him had been the foundation of his resilience. As Ethan prepared for his first official hearing, a knock echoed through his chamber doors. It was Angela, his clerk, a sharp and efficient woman in her early 40s who had been assigned to assist him. She peeked in, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Judge Harper," she said with a bright smile. "Your first case is on the docket, a procedural review for a small business dispute." Ethan nodded, slipping on his robe. "Thank you, Angela. Let's make it a good start." Meanwhile, across town, Officer Rick Morgan couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. It gnawed at him during his morning coffee and distracted him during his briefing at the precinct. The image of Ethan's disappointed yet composed face replayed over and over. For years, Rick had operated with a set of assumptions that guided his interactions on the job, but now those assumptions felt like weights dragging him down. Rick's day took an unexpected turn when he was called to the courthouse later that afternoon to testify in a routine traffic case. As he entered the courtroom, his eyes widened in disbelief. There, seated at the bench, was Ethan Harper, clad in his judicial robe, calm and composed. The bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harper." Rick stood, his stomach twisting into knots. He kept his gaze low as the hearing began, wishing he could melt into the walls. Ethan's voice was steady and professional as he addressed the room, laying out the facts of the case and questioning the attorneys. Rick noted the authority in Ethan's tone, the very authority he had doubted the night before. When it was Rick's turn to take the stand, he hesitated for a moment, then walked forward. Ethan looked at him with the same calm expression, betraying no hint of the previous night's encounter. "Officer Morgan," Ethan began, his voice neutral. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Rick's throat felt dry. "I do," he managed to say. The questions were straightforward, relating only to the case at hand. Ethan handled the proceeding with professionalism, ensuring all parties were heard and the facts were clear. But Rick could feel the unspoken weight of the situation between them, a tension that made him acutely aware of his actions the night before. As the hearing concluded and Ethan delivered his ruling, Rick felt both admiration and shame. Ethan's fairness and dignity shone through, casting a stark contrast to Rick's behavior during their first meeting. For the first time in years, Rick felt small, his prejudices laid bare under the light of Ethan's undeniable competence. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Rick lingered near the exit, debating whether to say something. Finally, he approached the bench as Ethan gathered his notes. "Judge Harper," Rick began, his voice quiet but earnest. Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Officer Morgan." Rick hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about last night. I was wrong. You didn't deserve that." Ethan regarded him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you for saying that. I hope it's something you'll think about moving forward." Rick nodded, the weight of Ethan's words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I will," he promised, before turning to leave. Ethan watched him go, hoping that their encounter would be a catalyst for change. He took a deep breath and returned to his chambers, ready for the next case. His path was far from easy, but he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. A few weeks passed, and life in Boston resumed its usual rhythm. For Ethan Harper, the challenges of his new role as a judge were as demanding as he'd anticipated. Each day brought new cases, new decisions to weigh, and new opportunities to prove himself. But amidst it all, he couldn't forget the encounter with Officer Rick Morgan. While Ethan had long learned to face prejudice with composure, something about that night lingered. It wasn't anger, but a quiet hope that perhaps, in some small way, he had changed Rick's perspective. For Rick, however, the encounter had left a more profound mark. He began noticing things he hadn't before, how his colleagues handled similar situations, how his own assumptions shaped his interactions. He started questioning his approach to the job, his bias lurking just beneath the surface. It was unsettling, but also eye-opening. One day, during a shift that took him near a local community center, Rick spotted a flyer on the bulletin board. It advertised a seminar on law enforcement and disability awareness. The keynote speaker, Judge Ethan Harper. Rick stared at the flyer, conflicted. He knew he should go, but the thought of facing Ethan in a public setting filled him with unease. Still, something inside pushed him to take the step. The evening of the seminar, Rick arrived at the community center, feeling out of place in his uniform amidst the casual crowd. The room was filled with people, advocates, parents, educators, and law enforcement. On the small stage at the front, Ethan stood, his robe replaced by a simple suit and tie. As the audience settled, Ethan began speaking. "I want to start by sharing a story," Ethan said, his voice steady and clear. "A story about assumptions." He recounted the challenges he had faced growing up, a world that often saw only his diagnosis and not his potential. He spoke of the teachers who doubted him, the classmates who teased him, and the countless times he'd been underestimated. Then he paused, his eyes scanning the audience. "But," Ethan continued, "there were also people who saw me for who I truly was, people who believed in me when others didn't. Those are the people who changed my life, who made it possible for me to stand here today. And that's what I hope for each of you, to see beyond appearances, to challenge your assumptions. Because when we do, we change lives, and sometimes our own." Rick felt a lump form in his throat. Ethan's words resonated deeply, cutting through years of unexamined biases. When the seminar ended, Rick lingered, waiting for the crowd to thin. He approached Ethan, his steps hesitant. "Judge Harper," he began, his voice softer than usual. Ethan turned, his expression neutral but curious. "Officer Morgan, I wanted to thank you," Rick said, "for sharing your story tonight, and for what you said a few weeks ago. It's been on my mind a lot." Ethan nodded, sensing the sincerity in Rick's words. "I'm glad to hear that." "I've been doing some thinking," Rick continued, fumbling slightly, "about how I do my job, about the way I see people. And I wanted you to know I'm trying to be better." For a moment, Ethan studied Rick's face, searching for signs of performative regret. Instead, he saw genuine humility. Ethan extended his hand, and Rick shook it firmly. "Change isn't easy," Ethan said, his tone measured but encouraging. "But it's worth it, and it's never too late to start." Rick nodded, a small smile breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "Thank you, Judge Harper, for everything." As Rick left the community center that night, he felt a sense of renewal. For the first time in years, he saw his badge not just as a symbol of authority, but as a chance to serve with compassion and fairness. And for Ethan, the encounter reinforced a truth he had learned long ago, that even the smallest act of understanding could ripple outward, creating a better world one person at a time. Months went by, and the city of Boston seemed to carry a subtle but significant shift. Ethan Harper became a respected name in the courthouse, not only for his fair judgments but also for the grace and wisdom he brought to every case. Stories of his perseverance spread, inspiring others to challenge their own limitations and the stereotypes they encountered. People came to see Ethan not as a judge with Down syndrome, but simply as Judge Harper, competent, insightful, and just. Meanwhile, Officer Rick Morgan embraced the change he had promised himself. He began attending workshops on community policing and actively engaged with advocacy groups. His colleagues noticed the difference. Rick, once rigid and brusque, now showed empathy and patience in his interactions. His reputation began to evolve, and younger officers sought him out as a mentor. One day, Rick was assigned to a community outreach program at a local high school. The event paired officers with students for a day-in-the-life experience, aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the public. Rick wasn't sure what to expect, but when he walked into the gymnasium, he saw Ethan there, standing with a group of students. Ethan spotted Rick and gave a slight wave, a small but warm smile on his face. Rick approached, his unease giving way to a sense of camaraderie. "Judge Harper," he greeted. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I volunteer with a mentorship program for these students," Ethan explained. "They're part of a leadership initiative. What about you?" Rick gestured to the group of officers setting up stations. "Outreach program, trying to show the kids we're not the bad guys." Ethan chuckled lightly. "Sounds like we're both in the business of changing minds." For the rest of the day, Ethan and Rick worked alongside each other, guiding students through exercises and sharing stories of their work. They noticed how their combined presence seemed to resonate with the students, showing them that people in authority weren't infallible, but could grow and learn just like anyone else. At the end of the event, a young boy approached Ethan and Rick. His name was Marcus, a shy teenager with glasses too big for his face. He hesitated, looking at them both before speaking. "Judge Harper," Marcus began, "I just wanted to say thank you. My little brother has Down syndrome, and sometimes people treat him like he's less than. But seeing you here, doing what you do, it makes me think he can do anything too." Ethan knelt slightly to meet Marcus's eye level. "Your brother can do amazing things, Marcus. And so can you. Just keep believing in each other." Rick watched the interaction, feeling a swell of admiration for Ethan's ability to connect so deeply with people. After Marcus left, Rick turned to Ethan. "You know," Rick said, "you've got a way of making people believe, even hard-headed guys like me." Ethan laughed softly. "Sometimes belief is all we need to get started." The two men shook hands, a gesture now rooted in mutual respect and understanding. As they parted ways that evening, neither knew if they would cross paths again, but both understood the impact they had on each other's lives. For Ethan, his role as a judge wasn't just about upholding the law. It was about showing the world that limitations were meant to be shattered. And for Rick, his badge had become more than a symbol of authority. It was now a tool to serve with empathy, fairness, and humility. Their journey, though separate, had become intertwined in a way neither could have foreseen, leaving a legacy of growth, understanding, and hope for everyone they touched.